Walking out of Season 11 PTR, the developers got a lot of feedback, is a very nice way to say it, about Sanctification, the new seasonal mechanic in Diablo 4 that clearly they also want to try to make a permanent system, but also in the most recent Campfire chat, a little bit made it sound like maybe it's not going to be a permanent system, so who knows. But it's at the very least testing out a mechanic that we find in other ARPGs. This is Vol Orbs from Path of Exile, this is Worldstone Shards from Project Diablo 2, which is inherently derived from Path of Exile. But it's the idea of taking a piece of gear and gambling to either slam it with something awesome or brick it. And that's kind of like the name of the game for what the system was trying to emulate and why I thought it was such a good system. I've played multiple ARPGs with this system in it, and I loved it. Not only that, I did the math and I broke it down and I reported my findings across all the different channels that I could. And it turns out a lot of people had a lot of opinions about not only Sanctification, but also my representation of it. The funny part being that my representation of the outcomes were purely mathematical. I went through and I collected data for over actually collected 800 data points to be able to determine what the outcomes were. This post got a lot of traction. It's actually probably one of my most viewed posts on Reddit. And a lot of people had a lot of very, very strong opinions. Now, luckily, going back and reading some of my responses here, I generally came out with a pretty good understanding of what people's pain points were. People tend to typically agree with my representation here. And then the people who disagreed had very powerful reasons for why they did. Now, all of that leads us to the changes that are coming to Sanctification. So I just want to very quickly go like top level here. What is different? One, the biggest concern that people had was bricking. To define what a brick is, because people were kind of using the word brick very willy-nilly, there was an outcome from Sanctification that said that you would replace a stat on your gear with a different stat. Now, that stat came from an incredibly powerful list of stats that were available, like brand new multipliers that you couldn't otherwise get. Not only that, that stat also sometimes included the stat that it replaced. So a great example here would be Shaco. A lot of people were very concerned about getting rid of their Shaco because Shaco has a huge amount of cooldown reduction. Now, funnily enough, one of the sanctifying affixes that you could add was cooldown reduction, with the big difference being here that it wouldn't get nearly as strong because it was a much lower roll and you wouldn't be able to masterwork it, etc. But people were afraid of getting rid of this. And they just changed it. You just can't brick these items anymore. So both uniques as well as mythic uniques cannot have their stat replaced. Now, what they don't describe here is if it were to replace, what happens instead. I think that option is just not available on those pieces of gear. And if I were to guess, that percentage chance for that to happen is just evenly distributed out amongst the other outcomes. The second big change that they made here is they got rid of basically the it did nothing outcome. Most of these options just will corrupt a piece of gear or make it unmodifiable, but not actually change anything. So you didn't lose your item, but it didn't get stronger, or your item didn't get bricked, or your item didn't get changed in some way. This is kind of like the consolation prize. It goes, hey, you gambled, but you didn't lose. Now, not everybody finds that particularly interesting, obviously, because nothing really happens. And on top of that, people will often see not winning something as losing something because they clicked a button and they didn't get the dopamine that they wanted. Now, that just comes down to how risk adverse you are versus how attuned you are to getting good outcomes from what you do. But in an ARPG, grinding and RNG are at the heart of this experience, or at least for me. So while some people saw this as a brick, I saw it as do nothing. And when we went through and we calculated all the outcomes and we looked at everything, here were the percent chances of any one outcome happening. There were 5 outcomes. One was adding a new aspect, which is just the strongest outcome. The bug from the PTR is that there weren't offensive aspects in the pool. Now it sounds like not only are there offensive aspects in the pool, but according to Art Pechkov, who said, and I quote, "I added some really crazy shit. There are supposedly very, very powerful outcomes that could happen when you get the aspect. The second thing that could happen is that you could take one of the affixes on your piece of gear and upgrade it to a greater affix. So obviously that is not nearly as powerful as an aspect, but still very, very good for a piece of gear. You would always want more aspects on your gear if you can manage to get them. Adding an affix comes from a very specific pool of powerful outcomes. This includes damage multipliers for your damage type, additional cooldown reduction, attack speed, +2 skills on jewelry, doubling the strength of gems in your gear so you could get stronger additive damage or stronger core stats. These are all a little bit more weird and niche stats. Some of them are just very good. Some of them are much stronger than other outcomes. The brick option was replacing an affix. So rather than just adding a 5th or 6th stat onto your gear, it would take a current stat that you have and replace it. And then the last outcome was removes durability, basically making them indestructible. Now, a lot of people pointed out that this does nothing for hardcore. Technically speaking, even though your character's dead, that item didn't lose durability. People didn't quite pick up on what I was saying when I would make that kind of joke, because yes, you've lost your character, the item's gone, but when it was gone, it was in pristine condition. But that being said, this was the nothing outcome. So people also saw this as a brick. Now, if we use the literal definition of brick, meaning an item can no longer be used in the way that it was previously, this had a 10% outcome. The chance to do nothing was 20% outcome. The chance to add an aspect was about 15%. The chance to add a greater affix was 20%. And the chance to add a random affix was somewhere between 30 and 32%. I would argue that the replace affix was only a 10% chance to happen, but per the patch notes, it doesn't really matter what that nuance was. It just straight up can't occur anymore. Now, it can still happen on legendary pieces of gear, but I think that there are much fewer and far in between scenarios where changing one of the stats on your legendary piece of gear is considered a brick. I think people will still make the argument that like losing out on passives on an amulet would consider bricking it. So now we're only talking about a single stat on a single item. And at that point, I guess we can argue that bricking still exists. But at least for your uniques and your mythics, which was most people's argument of a casual player's inability to get more of these when they needed them, that is gone. So that, at least that concern, that anxiety is completely gone. Now, durability was replaced. It wasn't merely just removed. It was changed to something that was stronger than even some of the other outcomes here. This is now going to add more quality to your gear. To understand what quality is, we have to understand the changes to masterworking. I just put out a video about all of the changes to masterworking, so I'll go ahead and link it here, just in case you're not completely up to date, but I'm not going to bore you to death. Masterworking adds quality to a piece of gear all the way up to 25%. Each one of those is going to increase your stats by 1% all the way up to a total of 25%. And then at the end, there's a capstone function, but that doesn't really matter for what we're talking about here. This outcome of durability, which is now actually just quality addition, means that 20% of the time, rather than do nothing, you're now going to gain between 5 to 25% more stats on your gear. This will increase the base stats like armor resistances and damage on your weapon. It'll also increase all of your affixes, your tempers, the stats on your mythics, etc. So now what the graph looks like as far as good versus bad outcomes. 10% of the time, you are going to replace a stat with a different stat. This might not be perfect for your gear. It might replace a single stat on your piece of gear that you might need, but this can no longer brick unique and mythic items. Then 90% of the time, you're going to get something that will make you stronger. You're either going to get 25% more stats across the board, you're going to gain an entirely new aspect that that item can have, you're going to add a greater affix to your piece of gear that it didn't have previously, or you're going to add a new affix from a pool of very strong outcomes. While we don't have the complete list that will be in the season, because almost certainly some of these will change, we at least have the Sanctification outcomes from the PTR. These included things like percentage core stat, something that isn't available in the game anymore, +2 to all skills, something that was available on jewelry, doubling the strength of gems in your gear, additional total resistance, additional core skills, additional all stats, crit chance, cooldown reduction, attack speed, movement speed, lucky hit chance, resource cost reduction, maximum resource, percentage increase to damage types. This is a whole new multiplier of damage, or even just something as simple as more maximum life. Those are the changes to Sanctification. That is how it's going to look mathematically unless we learn some other information. They didn't talk about changing these outcome percentages at all. That definitely could change. Anything is liable to change walking into the season. But this is roughly what it should look like, as long as this is the only difference that they made as far as outcomes, and just understanding that this can no longer negatively impact your unique items. Now, let me know what you think. Is this now good enough? If you were previously not a fan of Sanctification, or you thought it would ruin the game, or you thought it would make it so that casuals can't play the game, do you think that this is a good enough compromise? I'll be honest with you all. I personally think that this is too much. Now, I get it. I'm an elitist. I play a million hours. I have infinite items. None of that is really true. And in fact, as far as blasters are concerned, I'm effectively a casual in comparison to what a lot of other people do to play this game, where I might get a couple hundred hours out of a season, like 100 to 200 hours, depending on how much I'm invested. Other people are playing for significantly longer. But that being said, I recognize that clearly I have a bit of a leg up, right? I get to play this game for my job, which means I will play more hours than the typical person. but I'm not out here like just like taking a bunch of handouts or just getting free trades or whatever. People don't just pile gear onto me. I trade for everything that I would, or I play solo self-found like last season. So I personally think that these changes are removing a little bit too much of the tension, a little bit too much of the friction, and it's reducing how cathartic and how enjoyable it will be when you get a good outcome in comparison to a bad outcome. But I do understand and I do recognize that more people getting to enjoy this in general is just on average better for the universe, right? Or at least the universe where we're all playing a video game together. If more people like it, more people are getting enjoyment out of it, that means that in general, average happiness has increased. And if I lose a little bit of the chase, a little bit of the dopamine, so that some people who felt like this wasn't for them or they were being gatekept will now be able to engage with it, that makes me happy. But let me know what you think. If this is the first time that you've been here at the channel and you found this insight valuable, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss out. Leave a like on it as well. Comment down below if you had any other questions, you were looking for any other things being explained, or if you wanted to know about like theory crafting walking into the next season, let me know. I love to chat down there. Honestly, I respond to too many comments, but at least at this point, I can still manage it mentally. But that's enough of me yapping. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps. I look forward to seeing you in season 11.